we saw this Mishnah in the context of what we were learning previously, and in terms of which sukkahs are considered to be kosher. This is the Mishnah says, Simon got it. Sukkah Yeshena, Beis Shammai Poslin, Beis Hillel Machshirim. An old sukkah, Beis Shammai say it's possible, it's invalid, whereas Beis Hillel say it's kosher. Says Rashi, top right hand corner, Sukkah Yeshena, because Mefarish, as we're going to explain, what does it mean, an old sukkah? How old? She'asa kodim l'chag shloshim yom. So if it's been built 30 days before Sukkot, that's considered old. And in addition, it wasn't specified that it was being built for the sake of Sukkot. And we'll see what the relevance of that is in a moment. So if it was built 30 days before Sukkot and you didn't specify why you were building it, for the sake of which mitzvah you were building it, according to Beis Shammai, that is possible, whereas Beis Hillel will say no, it's kosher. Ask the Gemara, ask the Mishnah, Ve'ezehi Sukkah Yeshena. What is a Sukkah Yeshena? Here the Gemara spells it out, the Mishnah spells it out itself. Anything that's been built 30 days before the festival, as Rashi already sort of gave away the ending. Aval, says the Mishnah, if however, it would appear that even Beis Shammai would agree that if you were to specify that you're building it for the sake of the festival, then you could even if you built it at the beginning of the year, it would be kosher. Okay, so let's look at Rashi. So we saw the first Rashi, that an old sukkah, as we said, anytime more than 30 days before Sukkot, and you didn't specify why. The second line says Rashi, Beis Shammai posted, Beis Shammai say it's possible, it's invalid. By sukkah lishma, because Beis Shammai required the sukkah to be built specifically for the purposes of the mitzvah. V'zo stam nasis, and this one was built just stam for no specific reason. V'ilu toch shloshim lechag, who, however, so it would appear that Beis Shammai would require you that if you're going to build it more than 30 days before the festival, you have to specify that you're building it for the sake of the mitzvah. Otherwise, it's no good. What about why within 30 days do you not need to specify? It says Rashi, who, if it was within 30 days of the festival, since we have a requirement to ask about the halachas of a festival 30 days before the festival, that's halakha in Shulchan Aruch. Stam ha'oseh l'shem chag oseh. Then even without specifying, if a person is doing it within 30 days of the festival, even without specifying why they're doing it, they don't have to express that they're doing it for the sake of the mitzvah. It's considered as if they're doing it for the sake of the mitzvah. Stam ha'oseh l'shem chag oseh. Aval kodem shloshim stama lav l'chag. However, just building it stam without specifying 30 days before, it would not be kosher. So Rashi is saying, Beis Shammai's point is that if you build it within 30 days of the festival, even without specifying why you're building it, since you're in the parsha of Sukkot, because you're already learning about the halachas of Sukkot, then it's taken for granted. There's like a chazaka, a presumption that you are building it for the sake of the Sukkot, without having to say so. However, any time before 30 days, when you're not talking about Sukkot at all, if you don't specify why you're building it, then we have to assume you were building it for any other reason except for Sukkot, and it wouldn't be kosher. Says the Gemara, says Rashi, first of the narrow lines in Rashi, the end of the line, Beis Hillel machshirin, whereas Beis Hillel say no, it would be kosher. Deloi ba'inan sukkah l'shem chag. Beis Shammai say we don't require you to build the sukkah for the sake of the festival. He would say, and therefore, even 30 days before, it'd be kosher. And then the Mishnah ends off and says, Aval imasad l'shem chag afilu mitchilas hashana k'sheira. However, if you build it specifically for the purposes of Sukkot, even if you were to build it at the beginning of the year, meaning the day after last Sukkot, it would be kosher. Says Rashi, Lebeis Shammai itztrich. Says Rashi, the Mishnah needed to say this clause for Beis Shammai's purposes, because Beis Hillel obviously would hold that from the beginning of the year it would be fine because it doesn't require it to be done l'shem echad. So this Mishnah must say, really what it's saying is that even Beis Shammai would agree that if you were to specify that you're building it for the sake of the mitzvah, that you could even build it from the beginning of the year and it would be kosher. Is that clear? Okay, cool. Let's just look at Tosfos again. I think we touched on it very briefly last time. Let's look at the Tosfos over here on the top line. Sukkah Yeshena Beis Hillel Machshirin. So it would appear from our Mishnah and Rashi that Beis Hillel is not concerned at all about the need to build the sukkah for the sake of sukkahs. However, says Tosfos, Yerushalmi Tani Sarech L'Chadesh Ba'Davar. In the Yerushalmi, we see that it teaches that an old sukkah, if you were to leave your sukkah up from year to year, then the Yerushalmi would say that's fine, even though you haven't built it this Shema for this coming year. You need to do something new to it in order to, in some way, demonstrate that this is now for this sukkah. It says on the second line, Chaburah Amrin and Tefach. There's a bit of machlokas in Yerushalmi how much you need to do. To what extent do you need to do something demonstratively in order to show that it's for this sukkah? So according to the first opinion, like Rabbanan would say, Tefach, you need to do something to the size of a tefach, not very much, it's about a handbreadth to the sukkah. Whereas Rabbi Yossi Amar, Kol Shehu, Rabbi Yossi was even less, even a Kol Shehu, even the smallest amount, just something to make some sort of adjustment to the sukkah in order to show you're doing it for the sake of the sukkah. However, says Tosfos, and Rabbi Yossi said that you need to the smallest amount. He would say that smallest amount has to be over the whole of the sukkah. So it doesn't have to be anything very significant, but it would have to be significant enough, or it would have to be something insignificant, well, not insignificant, but of very small significance, but over the whole of the sukkah. Okay? And then the Gemara goes on and talks about Bata Hachi Itza Hasan Matza Yeshena Plugta to Beis Shammai Beis Hillel. It also appears to be a discrepancy or a disagreement between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel in relation to matzah. Again, I think I mentioned this last time, that matzah, as we know, has to be made l'shem mitzvah. We have what's known as matzah mitzvah. Matzah made specifically for the mitzvah of achilas matzah on Leil Seder. It would appear that there would also be a machlokas there. Rebbe Divrei Hakol who given Shelo Asa l'shem Pesach Divrei Davar Bari who Shelo Dikdakbar. There it would appear that actually no, there's no dispute between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai. Even Beis Hillel would appear to agree when it comes to the matzah that since you've not done anything for the sake, if you do it too early, if you do it any time before 30 days before Pesach without specifying that you're doing it then it's quite clear that you're not being particular to do it l'shem mitzvah. So there, even Beis Hillel would agree that you can't keep if you made matzah the day after Pesach, you can't keep it and use it at Seder the next year because then it's quite clear that you weren't particular to make it for the sake of the mitzvah of Achilas Matzah on Leil Pesach, which is not the case here. Beis Hillel is the opinion that even a tiny sort of adjustment would be sufficient when it comes to a sukkah that's left up from year to year. Okay, is that clear? Okay. Just look at Tosfos again, the next Tosfos. Look at the next Tosfos. V'im asar l'shem chag v'chulei afilu lebeis Hillel nafkaminei shein sarach v'chadesh b'davar. It would appear that even Beis Hillel doesn't require you to renew anything about it. And even though that last clause of the Mishnah was only needed, as Rashi said, for Beis Shammai, to say that Beis Shammai would agree that even if you did it at the beginning of the year, As long as you specified you're doing it for the sake of the coming sukkahs, it's fine. Ela leBeis Shammai yesh lo l'tana the parish demad nechleku lo sharach leukshei time of the Beis Shammai, and we don't need that to establish the reason of Beis Shammai. Just to show us that there's this machlokas between the Tanas of the Mishnah in relation to Beis Shammai. It doesn't tell us anything about the nature of the dispute in relation to Beis Hillel. And he goes on and talks about this. We have to look at that a bit here. Okay, so Tosfos is also making the same point that we did much as Rashi is, that that last part of the Mishnah is merely to show us something about Beis Shammai, and not to tell us, oh, by the way, both Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai would agree in this situation. No, it basically is telling us that even though Beis Shammai doesn't allow an old sukkah, he would if the person making it specifies why they are making it. Okay, let's look at the Gemara. Says the Gemara, my time at the Beis Shammai. So what is the reason that Beis Shammai doesn't allow an old sukkah? Says the Gemara, based on the Pasuk. Amakras, the Pasuk says in Vayikra, Chag HaSukkah Shivas Yamim LaHashem. The Pasuk says, should be a festival of Sukkah 7 days for Hashem. What does that mean? Sukkah ha'asu l'shem chag ba'inan. Beis Shammai said that means that you have to have a sukkah made for the sake of the festival. Look at Rashi. First Rashi, Sukkah l'shem chag dichsib sukkos l'Hashem l'shem mitzvos hamelech. Why does the Pasuk say Chag HaSukkos Shivas Yamim l'Hashem? That it should be a festival of Sukkot for 7 days to Hashem. What's that? Hashem doesn't celebrate Sukkot. We celebrate Sukkot. What does it mean, says Beis Shammai? It means that you have to build the Sukkah l'shem Hashem, meaning l'shem HaMelech, for the sake of mitzvahs Hashem. Now, not that you just happen to have a Sukkah standing all through the year and you use that for Sukkot. No, you have to make a Sukkah specifically for the sake of the mitzvah. So this question is, who Beis Hillel? What does Beis Hillel use this pasuk for? How does Beis Hillel use this pasuk that he doesn't use it to say the same thing as Beis Shammai? So says the Gemara, Beis Hillel, he says he needs it for that which Rav Sheshes taught. To Amo Rav Sheshes, because Rav Sheshes says, Mishum Rabbi Akiva, name of Rabbi Akiva, how do we know that the wood, meaning any materials used to make sukkah, are also to have any benefit from for the whole 7 days? How do we know that you can't to have any benefit from any of the materials used in the construction of your sukkah for the duration of sukkahs? Talmud Loma, says the Gemara, Rav Sheshi would learn in the name of Rabbi Akiva, we learn it from this pasuk, Chag HaSukkos Shivas Yamim LaHashem, that the festival should be a festival of sukkahs for 7 days for Hashem, meaning that what you use to build your sukkah can only be used for the sake of the sukkah and nothing else. It's what's known as huksa l'mitzvasa. It's a type of muksa. When something is set aside for the sake of a mitzvah, you can't use it for anything else. So since the pasuk says Chag HaSukkos Shivas Yamim LaHashem, the sukkah is almost the festival of sukkahs is 7 days for Hashem, meaning your sukkah is dedicated to Hashem for 7 days, and you can't make use of it. The Tanya Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira Omer, Kashem shechal shem shamayim al hachagiga, kach shem shamayim al hasukkah. And a similar teaching to that we've just seen, according to in the name of Rabbi Sheshes, Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira would say that just as the korban chagiga. Now, on the Shosh Regalim, anyone who came up to Yerushalayim had to bring a korban chagiga, a festival offering. That's where the way chag comes from. It takes its name from the chagiga, the festival offering. And we know, just as the korban chagiga is once it becomes mukdash, once it's set aside for offering in the Beis HaMikdash, you cannot benefit from it in any other way, meaning you can't use its meat or any of parts of it for anything else than a korban. Look at Rashi, second Rashi, Allah HaChagiga, Shalmei Chagiga, it's the Shalmei Chagiga, the offering of the Chagiga, Shem Shemayim Chal Aleihem. Once the name of Hashem falls upon it, meaning once it's been set aside for use in the Beis HaMikdash, le'osrin, it becomes forbidden. Ad la'acha hataras emurim, until some of its parts have been offered. Zaku bahu basahachi mishulchan gavoa. Because until that point, it is destined for the shulchan gavoa, which means the exalted table, meaning for Kodesh Baruch Hu himself. Ke'eved hanotel pras, otherwise it would be like a servant who takes his payment before he's done any work, before he's done the job. Yeah. So we cannot make use of the meat of the animal until its parts have been offered on the mizbeach. So says the Gemara. Back in the Gemara, Kashem shechal shem shemayim ala chagig, kach al shem shemayim ala sukkah. So just as the korban chagiga cannot be used once it's set aside for the use in the Beis HaMikdash, so too once the shem shemayim of sukkah falls upon it, meaning once it becomes sukkahs, once it becomes chag hasukkah shivas Hashem la'Hashem, shivas Hashem la'Hashem, you cannot make any use of the sukkah. Shneimah, as the Pasuk says, Chag HaSukkah Shiva Shamim LaHashem. It should be a festival of sukkahs for you for 7 days. Ma Chag LaHashem, Af Sukkah LaHashem. Just as the festival is for Hashem, and Rashi says one word here. When we say Chag, we mean the Chagiga. When we say festival, we mean the Korban Chagiga, the festival offering. Just as Ma'achag Hashem, just as the korban is for Hashem, so the sukkah is also for Hashem, meaning it's set aside for the mitzvah and cannot be used for any other purpose. Just look at Rashi. Chag HaSukkah. No, sorry, that's not our Rashi. Does that make sense? So Beis Hillel used that pasuk to learn something where Rabbi Chapper, something Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira learns, which is you cannot make use of the sukkah for all 7 days because it's set aside for the mitzvah. Now the question is, well, what about Beis Shammai? How does Beis Shammai learn this halacha that you can't make use of the sukkah for 7 days? So says the Gemara, where are we? Yeah, here. Beis Shammai nami mibayalei lahachi. But surely, says Asad Gemara, surely Beis Shammai also needs this pasuk to teach us halacha. We don't find recorded anywhere that Beis Shammai disagrees with Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira in relation to the fact that you can't make use of the wood of the sukkah and the materials used for the sukkah of the 7 days. So surely Beis Shammai also needs this pasuk to learn this halacha, and therefore this pasuk isn't free for his limud of a sukkah yeshena, of an old sukkah being possible, meaning that it has to be built for the sake of sukkahs. So we're almost, we're back to square one with Beis Shammai. Says the Gemara, in Hakinami, you're right. You're right. And we're going to have to find an alternative source. Just go back, before we do, just want to look at this Tosfos on the left-hand side, Tosfos Minayim. So I'm just seeing, the Gemara asks, Minayim, let's say, Sukkah She'osin Kol Shiva. Where do we know that the materials used for building the Sukkah are osa for the whole of 7 days? Says Tosfos, Mashmada is Siri Midoraisa. That would infer, the question the Gemara is asking is, where do we know in the Torah that this is forbidden all 7 days? But Darsha Gemurahi, the Gemara answers, we're going to explain that it is a tradition Mafrich v'hakra la'achihu. To utter, as it would bring a posset. Yeah. V'teimu de perakira, and it says, and he says it's, well, the question is asked in Gemara in Shabbos. Mashma shumi d'Rabbanan. It would appear actually, even further, actually it's a d'Rabbanan. T'maisi Hasan Mariah. Then we actually bring a proof. Yeah, as he says, the Rabbi Shimon Islay Gabe Ne Mitok. Yeah, I mean, to hooks, here's the way. To hooksula mitzvasa, hooksula is surah. That when something is set aside for a mitzvah, it is set aside for issa. Meaning, if something has been set aside for the sake of a mitzvah, meaning the materials used to build the sukkah have been specifically made into a sukkah for the sake of the mitzvah, you cannot use them for anything else. Okay, just skip down a little bit to where did this hold of this Tosfos? I just want to show you something very interesting in the Tosfos here. If you look at the wide lines of Tosfos here, the end of the line. Gemara is going to say, well, Tosfos' question is this: that we knew at the outset. When the Gemara asked, the very first question the Gemara asked was, "My time of Rabbi Beis Shammai. What is the reason that Beis Shammai also you to have a sukkah that's old?" And we said, because of the pasuk, that it should be a festival sukkah for 7 days, meaning it has to be specifically made for the sake of the mitzvah. And yet we now say, hold on a second, Beis Shammai can't use that pasuk because he used that pasuk for the nimud of Rabbi Yosef ben Beseira, which is that the sukkah that's been the materials of the sukkah can't be used for anything else during sukkahs. So you ask the question: if you knew that was going to be the outcome, that you can't use that pasuk for Beis Shammai's reason, then why suggest it in the first place? Why suggest something you know you're going to knock down? So it says to us something fascinating. It says here, even though at the outset we knew that this wasn't the reason of Beis Shammai, or you could say, even though at the outset we knew the real reason for Beis Shammai saying what he said, the truth is, this is the way of Shas. This is what happens in the Gemara. Lefarish devarav derech kasha v'teretz, to explain something by way of question and answer. So, although we know what the answer is going to be, why not just get to the answer? That's derech hashas. That's the way Gemara works. It's based on questions and answers. Yeah, Seder, why do we need to go through the answers and the questions? We know the answer. We've heard the answer however many years we've been doing the Seder. That's the way. That's the way of the Seder. That's what it's meant to be. Shilas and Teshuvos. That's the way of the Gemara. Kashas and Terutzim. Questions and answers. Now, there's another way of explaining it, which is that if we didn't set it up in this way, the Gemara does this on purpose, because it sets up, it gives answers which then sometimes dismisses, because if it doesn't do it that way, you could always be left with the question, which is, well, why didn't the Gemara ask that question? That might always be a possibility in your back of your mind. Well, perhaps, it could have been this. So the Gemara heads that off. It says, okay, I'll ask that question, knowing that's not going to be the answer. So just so we deal with every single eventuality, we cross those all the potential possibilities off the list till we get to the actual answer. Okay, so that was an interesting thing to look at. Okay, let's go back in the Gemara. So says the Gemara, en hachanami, you're right. Beis Shammai can't use that pasuk to teach his limud of a sukkah yeshena that requires to be made for the sake of sukkahs, because he needs it for the very same thing that Rabbi ben Beseira is saying, the Beis Hillel is saying, which is that the materials of the sukkah are forbidden for use during sukkahs. So says the Gemara, Elamai time at the Beis Shammai. Rather, what's the real reason? What's the real source of Beis Shammai's reason? Says the Gemara, Kasiv, there's another posuk, the posuk in Devarim. Kasiv Krach, there's another posuk where it says, Chakasukos ta'aseh lecha shivas yamim. Posuk says, very similar posuk. It says, Chakasukos ta'aseh lecha. The festival of Sukkot you should make for yourself 7 days. Okay, I've just read it to exactly the way it says it. Says the Gemara, what does that mean? Sukkah ha'asu l'shem chag ba'inan. That's telling us that the sukkah has to be for the sake of the festival. Again, let's look at the passage again. You shall make for yourself sukkahs for the festival. It's quite explicit there. Quite explicit that you have to make it specifically for the mitzvah. As Rashi says, Chag HaSukkos, a bit further up. It's quite a bit further up now. Chag HaSukkos ta'aseh. Sukkos ta'aseh l'chag saris ha'mikra v'dushu. So the passage is written in this way in order to allow us to expound it, to explain it. So it says the Gemara. Now we've got a problem with the Beis Hillel. Who Beis Hillel mibayel, beginning of the next line. Who Beis Hillel mibayele. So what about Beis Hillel? What would he use that pasuk for? What would he agree that pasuk seems to say that the sukkah has to be made specifically for the sake of sukkahs? Says the Gemara, Ubeis Hillel hahu mibayele le'osin sukkah b'chodesh moed. No, Beis Hillel uses this pasuk to tell us that you can build a sukkah during Chol Moed. And says Rashi, b'chodesh moed im lo asam etchila. If you didn't get a chance to build your sukkah erev sukkahs, obviously you can't build it on Yom Tov, but during Chol Moed you can build a sukkah. Yeah, meaning any time you need to build a sukkah, any of the 7 days of sukkahs, you need a sukkah. So if you didn't have one from the beginning of sukkahs, you can build it during Chol Moed. Says Rashi, pluktu to Rabbi Eliezer beperek hayasha, uparchina lebeis Hillel to lo bay lishma. Name a gabi tzitzis. Oh, we're going to see what Rashi is going to say here. We're going to see later on. We're going to see in Chav Zayin and Beis that we see quite clearly that Beis Shammai, that Beis Hillel does not require the sukkah to be a lishma for the sake of sukkahs, and yet, and also when it comes to sitzes, we're going to ask the question: what about with sitzes? And that's the very next thing we're going to see. The Rav Yehuda Amarav. We'll see that in a moment. Actually, it always seems to be sort of trying to give the game away here a little bit. I'm just looking at Tosfos. Yeah, that's an old mess one. Yeah. So Beis Hillel needs that pasuk to teach us something different, which is if you haven't built your sukkah before sukkahs, you can build it during Chol Moed. Beis Shammai svir lahu Rabbi Eliezer. No, and Beis Shammai hold like Rabbi Eliezer to Amar ein osin sukkah b'chodesh Moed. Whereas Beis Shammai don't need that pasuk for that because they hold like Rabbi Eliezer that a sukkah cannot be built during Chol Moed. And that you'll see, if you can see in the margin there, it says the Kaman Chav Zayin Omid Beis. And if you want to keep your finger in the place and then just skip forward, more later on Chav Zayin on a base right at the top, we'll say, Amru, can you see that top of the line? No, it's not on the base, isn't it? Yeah. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, at the end of Chav Zayin on the Dala. Rabbi Eliezer Omer. According to Rabbi Eliezer, on sukkahs you can't go from one sukkah to another. Says Rashi, what does that mean? To eat in one and sleep in another one, or one day in one and one day in another. Meaning you have to make your sukkah. Basically, you have to make your bed and lie in it. You make your sukkah, and that is your sukkah for the whole of 7 days. You can't swap around and go from sukkah to sukkah on different days. The ain sukkah b'chodesh moed, and you can't make a sukkah on the Chol Moed. The Chachamim omrim yotzim sukkah to sukkah. We don't pass on like Beis Shammai or Rabbi Eliezer. We pass on like Chachamim. We say, no, you can go from one sukkah to another. Versus sukkah b'chodesh moed, and you can make a sukkah on Chol Moed if you didn't make one before Yom Tov. Says Rashi, mi sheloi yashav b'sukkah Yom Tov harishon. Yeah, a person who didn't. Let's say you weren't able to sit in the sukkah on on first day Sukkot. On Chol Hamoed, make one. Similarly, v'shavim she'im nafla shechozer b'nei Chol Hamoed. They both agree that if your sukkah was to fall down, then you could rebuild it on Chol Hamoed. But according to Rabbi Eliezer, and this is how Beis Shammai follows, that you couldn't build it afresh on Chol Hamoed. Ask the Gemara there, my time at Rabbi Eliezer, what's Rabbi Eliezer's reasoning why you can't build it on Chol Hamoed? Amakura, because our Pasuk says, Chachasukas ta'aseh lecha shiva shamim. Asa sukkah haroi l'shiva. According to Rabbi Eliezer, the Pasuk says, when it says you should make a sukkah for yourself for 7 days, meaning you need to make a sukkah which is fit for 7 days, meaning it has to stand for at least 7 days. You can't start building it with it, after a couple of days of sukkahs. A sukkah is only going to stand or be used for 4 days, 3 days, 4 days, 5 days, whatever. It has to be a sukkah that's going to be used all 7 days. Okay, so base come back to our Gemara. So Beis Shammai holds like Rabbi Eliezer that you cannot build a sukkah during Chol Hamoed, and therefore he doesn't need this pasuk to teach us this. Therefore, he can use it to teach what he wanted to teach.
So who do we hold with? Do we hold that you can't build it during Chol Hamoed, or that we can?
No, we hold that you can. We don't go like Rabbi Eliezer. We go like Chachamim. You can go from sukkah to sukkah throughout Yom Tov, and you can build a sukkah during Chol Hamoed.
Okay.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. Let's go back in the Gemara. Beis Shammai severe leik Rabbi Eliezer ta'amar ein osin sukkah b'chodesh Hamoed. Yeah, well, what about Beis Hillel? Does he not go like Rabbi Eliezer? So says the Gemara. Yeah, here. Gemara now asks a question on Beis Hillel. Ubeis Hillel leis lahu de Rabbi Yehuda Amar Rav. Is it possible, says the Gemara, that what Beis Hillel is saying does not accord with that which has been said by Rabbi Yehuda in the name of Rav? Ta'amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Rav. Asar min ha-kotzis. Now we move on to a different subject here. We're moving on to tzitzis. Gemara here is asking. Actually, that was the last bit of Rashi we just saw. Is it really the case that Beis Hillel does not require a sukkah to be made lishma for the sake of the mitzvah? Is that really what we're saying? Because that would seem to be a bit of a problem. Why? Because let's look at the following. So Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav. Asar min ha-kotzis. Now talking about tzitzis. If you were to make tzitzis, and we're talking about here about the gedilim, about the string. If you were to make the tzitzis min ha-kotzin from thorns, and says Rashi, what are these thorns? Min ha-kotzin, it doesn't mean literally thorns, vegetable thorns. It means chutim shintaku b'shesi. When you're weaving fabric, if the thread breaks, the weaver will knot together the two ends of the piece and continue weaving. But it's going to leave a little bit of a knot, a little bit of a thorn in it, in the material. It says, and he ties them together, but to luin rashehem, the beged, and they hang the corner of the garment that you attach this to. What will happen is that bit of the material that had the knot in it in the weave, it's bolted. It's going to protrude like a thorn pushing through. If you ever put like a piece of material up against thorns, they're always push through the material, right? So this knot in the thread is going to push through the surface of the material. And if it's by the corner of the garment, you might think, I could use that as tzitzis. We're going to see, no, you can't. That's the first thing. Mina kotzin, mina nimin. Nimin are like embroidery bits, I think it is here. Yeah, like stitching. It says Rashi mina ninim, kagon talish shutfruhu. For example, like a talis, a garment that's been sewn, or she'asaba amira b'mechat, or again some sort of thing, a needle thread has been attached to it. V'rashi chuti hatfira. So I think it's like it's embroidered. I think is what it means. You've got material, and then thread has been added to that material, and the threads are hanging down from it. Mehen gidlu hatzitzis, and from them, almost like Rashi saying, like the tzitzis grow. So they hang down. So you've got a bit of like when you've got an edge of a piece of garment, you've got a bit of thread hanging down. So if some embroidery being put onto a garment, and that a bit of it hangs down from the edge, and that would be the beginnings of tzitzis, also no good. And then the third case is uminha gardin pasula. And also, again, some sort of addition to the material of the tzitzis at the edges of the tzitzis. Pasula, says the Gemara. Pasula. That would, those three things would be possible for use as tzitzis. Look at Rashi, Pasula. Here, beginning of the line. Pasula. Hoil v'teluin v'omdim kol eile b'beged. Since these are hanging and remaining on the garment, they were part of the garment. They weren't added to the garment for the sake of tzitzis. They weren't l'shem tzitzis. They just happened to be part of the garment, something which happened to protrude or be in addition to the garment. Lav asir lishmahi, but they weren't made for the sake of the mitzvah of tzitzis. And as we're going to see, we have two pesukim that require tzitzis to be made l'shem mitzvah tzitzis. That's when if you ever make tzitzis, they have to be made l'shem mitzvah. So you've got the beged, you've got the garment. When you add the threads to it, they have to be added for the purposes of not the garment, but of the mitzvah of tzitzis. We'll see in a moment those two pesukim that tell us about that. Okay, so we see quite clearly that there is a requirement of l'shem mitzvah when it comes to tzitzis. So go back in the Gemara. Gemara carries on a little bit more and says, "Umin hasisim kashera." However, if the tzitzis are made from sisin, says Rashi, pekuos, kedurios, like balls of, again, shelchut, balls of thread, and he puts in the old French there. Lumshit, not exactly what it means. Kashera. That would be kosher, says Rashi. Hoil vishnidlu bebeged l'shem tzitzis. Since these were added, these hang from the garment for the sake of tzitzis. Nidlu asi lishma. We find that they are hanged for the purposes. Lishmahi. Teve lishma lo ba'inen she'ein tevim min ha'asu. Meaning it was. Tivi means sewn. It was sewn, weaved for this purpose, and we require we require it to be sewn and weaved for the purpose, and not just already there. Meaning, and like we saw, if it was already part of the garment, it can't be used for tzitzis. But if you add it specifically l'shem mitzvah tzitzis, then it's kosher. Okay, so that's the Gemara. We're just building this up now. We're just seeing this idea of l'shem mitzvah. Says the Gemara, Ki amirta k'mei de Shmuel. So says Rabbi Yehuda, when I said this teaching of Rav in the presence of Shmuel, and Rashi says, interesting historical fact here, Ki amirta here. Ki amirta k'mei de Shmuel. Rabbi Yehuda talmido shel Rav. Rabbi Yehuda was a Talmud, a student of Rav. As we saw, he said it, he originally quoted the name of Rav. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Amar Rav. Rabbi Yehuda said the name of Rav. When he said it in the name of, when he said this in front of Shmuel, V'shel Shmuel hi la'acha b'tziraso shel Rav. He became, when Rav died, Rav and Shmuel were contemporaries. When Rav died, Rabbi Yehuda became a Talmud of Shmuel. Omer Shmuos Mishmoi and he would say over things he'd learned from Rav in his name. Kacham Ali Rav, he would say, "This is what Rav told me." Shmuel, the Chalek Alav, when he said things in front of Shmuel, he would disagree with him because Rav and Shmuel would disagree about lots of things. Even though they would disagree about this last point, we'll see, Rav and Shmuel still agreed about this idea of lishma, that the tzitzis have to be made for the purposes of the mitzvah. So ki amir to kamei Shmuel amali af min hasisin nami basula. When I told this halakha, when I said this halakha in the name of Rav over to Shmuel, he said no. He said no, that even min hasisin, even from these balls of thread that hang down from the garment, which have been added to them afterwards, it also be possible. This out the world Alma, says Gemara, to ba'inan to via lishma, because we require the sewing, the weaving to be done for the sake of the mitzvah. Now, that's a whole long way of saying, and now Gemara gets back to our point. Hachinami nibaya sukkah asur lishma. Here also, surely we would agree that what we're also saying is, surely Hillel would also agree, Beis Hillel would also agree, that a sukkah has to be made lishma. It can't just be min ha'asui. It can't just be that a sukkah can be used for some that's been standing all year round. Just looking at that Rashi there. Where did we see that Rashi? You see the point? How could it be that Shmuel would hold of the requirement of lishma, the things have to be made for the sake of the mitzvah, as we see he does clearly when it comes to tzitzis. If he doesn't hold that with sukkah, how can he go against what Beis Hillel say? Beis Hillel don't seem to be concerned that the sukkah needs to be made lishma. Then how can Rav and Shmuel be of the opinion that tzitzis have to be made lishma? Do you understand the question? Okay. So Gemara answers here. Shani Hassan. It's different there. In relation to tzitzis, it's different to sukkah. Why? To Amakra, because the Pasuk says, Gedilim ta'aseh lach. You shall make gedilim, strings, for yourself. Lach l'shem chovecha. Says the Gemara, when it says, why does it say you should make it for yourself? Lach, for yourself. It means l'shem chovecha, for the sake of your obligation. Meaning, you have to specifically make the tzitzis for the sake of tzitzis. It's not good enough that they just happen to be something protruding from something you made to be worn as a garment. The Torah specifies it with relation to tzitzis. It doesn't specify it in relation to sukkah, and therefore it's not a contradiction. There's no specific requirement for sukkah to be made for the sake of sukkahs, whether it is for tzitzis. Says the Gemara. Hold a second. Now there is a pasuk that says the word lecha. You should make a sukkah for yourself. What does that mean? Lecha mean lecha l'shem chovecha. It will say the same thing. You should make the sukkah for the sake of your obligation, meaning you have to specifically make the sukkah for the mitzvah of sukkahs. It's not good enough for it just to be standing all year round. How can Beis Shammai say that? Says the Gemara. No. When the Torah says lecha, you have to make it for yourself, the sukkah, that's not to tell you it has to be made for the sake of sukkahs. What it's telling you is you need to make it yourself. You can't steal it. The Torah is saying a sukkah gazela is possible. A stolen sukkah is possible. Why? Because it says you've got to make your own sukkah. You can't steal someone else's. So it says the Gemara, Hasam Nami. Hold on a second, we're not finished. It says the Gemara, Hasam Nami mebayle lemute gazula. Oh, okay then. If you're going to say the word lecha is to teach you have to make it and not steal it. Well, let's say that about tzitzis as well. Perhaps the pasuk where it says gedilim ta'aseh lach, you should make tzitzis for yourself. It means you have to make them and you can't steal them. So it means nothing about making them the Shema. So perhaps since don't have to make it the Shema. So the answer to the Gemara, bottom line of the Gemara, Hasam Ksiv Kara. There's another posuk in relation to Tzitzis. The posuk we're familiar with from the Shema. It says in Bamidbar, Hasam Ksiv Kara Chrina. There's another posuk in relation to Tzitzis in Bamidbar that says, V'asu lahem. They shall make for themselves. V'asu lahem. They shall make for themselves, says the Gemara, Misha lahem, from their own. Meaning they have to be made for, or either you can read it two ways. Either that posuk is telling you that tzitzis can't be stolen, allowing you to use the posuk of Gedilim Taseh Lach, of you should make tzitzis for yourself to teach you how to make the Shema. Or you can say, no, we've got two pasukim that are telling you that they have to make the Shema, whereas with sukkahs we don't. We only have one pasuk that says sukkahs ta'aseh lecha, and that is to tell you lecha and not min hagezel, not from the stolen sukkah. Okay, let's just look at the last toast first. There, we won't see all of it. Just want to see it really quickly. So, was a question? No.
So if we're saying this, make it for yourselves is the indicator it can't be stolen, does that mean that if there's a commandment that doesn't use that, you can use stolen?
For which tzitzis?
So we've said both of 6 sits for sukkah. We have this phrase for yourselves in there,
yeah,
to indicate you can't use a stolen one.
Yeah.
So if there's another mitzvah where you need to do something, lulavim, whatever, for yourselves, that means it can't be stolen. So is there something where there's requirement to do something that doesn't have the for themselves, would almost suggest, well, if that one doesn't say it, using a stolen one will be okay.
Right. So, very good question. You're right, and in fact, well, we're going to see. We've got the third parak, the third chapter of Sukkah is entitled Lulav HaGazol, a stolen lulav.
Okay.
In fact, it's not so clear cut with the sukkah. What are we talking about when we think about a stolen sukkah? Are we talking about you literally go and pick up someone's sukkah and take it? That clearly you can't do. That you clearly can't do because it's a gazula. It's stolen and it has to be your own. What about you squat? You find a sukkah, the back of someone's house, and you go and decamp into that sukkah for 7 days, and they come to the door and say, "Really, I'm sorry, no, it's my sukkah. I'm really sorry." It's a civil matter, not a criminal matter, right? It's squatters' rights. Yeah, they'll have to go to court. It'll take them 7 days to get an injunction to get you out, right? Then the Gemara says, "Kaka en exeles." Actually, although technically you haven't stolen anything, because the ground has not been stolen, you can't steal land. Because land has a voice, it has a call, it can't be stolen. So we'll see that. That's another discussion, but it's not as clear cut. But lulav hagazol, quite clearly, if you take someone else's lulav, that's quite clear, doesn't belong to you. And the pasuk says, "L'kachtem lachem bayom harash." Again, it says lachem, that you should take for yourselves for the first day. So more there, in the third parak is going to say, okay, that's "L'kachtem lachem bayom harishon," says the Torah. You should take for yourself on the first day. So the requirement for it to be your own is only on the first day. What about the rest of sukkahs, when it doesn't have to be your own? What about a stolen sukkah? So this is actually what Tosfos mentions here. And he mentions it in passing, that's why I won't see the whole of Tosfos. Just look, he says, Hahu midbayale, this Tosfos here, Hahu midbayale muta gezula. So we said that Chaka sukkah taseh lecha is to tell us that that's needed to tell you that you can't use a stolen sukkah. Someone should ask this. Why do we need a posuk to tell us that a stolen sukkah is possible? You can't use it. Why do we need that word lachad to tell you it has to be yours? We can derive it from a principle which is ha-mitzvah ba'avera. This is the whole sugya in the third parak, which is it would be a mitzvah that comes about through an avera. Of course, that's not going to be okay. That is why you can't use a stolen lulav for the rest of sukkahs. Even though you haven't got the word lachem, you can't use it for the rest of sukkahs because it's a mitzvah ba'avera. Why not use that here? Asked Tosfos this question here. Yeah, it says the my time with Pasulin Esrog goes beyond Sheni. That's what we use to explain why an Esrog, also an Lulav as well. It's actually, we look at the note there, it changes it to the word Lulav here. You see, it says Esrog in Tosus, it says Lulav, the same thing. Yeah, it's Lulav. Beyond Tov Sheni, Lekaman, Mishum Tahavele, that's the answer we give there. So the question is, why here do I need the limit of lachem for themselves? Mishal lachem. Im you hasam ikka the shinu it is stricken we would say sure so we answer there. The reason why we need it there is to exclude a borrowed sukkah, not a stolen one. You have permission to go in it. We would say, or a borrowed lulav. A borrowed lulav on first day is no good. But for the rest of sukkahs, no problem at all. You can borrow someone else's lulav, not a problem. Whereas a sukkah, it would appear that it says Tosus Amagabe sukkah lekei l'shinui hachi l'Rabbanan. Whereas the rabbis don't teach out here in relation to sukkah. Look, as it says later on in Chaf Saman Amar, the Adam Yotzi Yidei Chovasai Sukkah Shel Chaveiro. We can say that the person can. Remember, we saw the machlokas between Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim. Rabbi Eliezer said you can't go from one sukkah to another. You can't go sukkah crawling, right? You have to build your own sukkah and live in your own sukkah for one sukkah for the whole of the Yom Tov. No, Chachamim said no, it's not a problem. You can fulfill your obligation. Even you don't even have to build your own sukkah. Chachamim will tell you, building the sukkah is also known as a hechsher mitzvah. It's merely a preparation for the mitzvah. And if you pass the night Beis Hillel, you don't even have to build it. If it's up the whole year round, it doesn't have to be lishma. It's good to go. We borrow it there from a pasuk. So that's why that's the difference here. That here we're talking about a stolen sukkah as opposed to a borrowed sukkah, and that's why we don't use the limit of mitzvah ba'avera, because we'll see that only seems to apply when something is okay on one day or requires a pasuk for one day, but not for the other days. This would be for the whole stretch of the Yom Tov. Okay. All right, that's the end of that sugya. Next time is a new Mishnah about making a sukkah under a tree or building one sukkah on top of another sukkah. Okay, we'll leave it there.